Welcome to the Bader Hour, a citizen assembly meeting produced by Staci Gustafson of the Universal Community Project. Dan Bader connects the dots between corrupt state government, pharmaceuticals, elites, climate change, depopulation, and more. What you need to know to be mentally healthy in a challenging world. Hello and welcome. I'm Staci Gustafson. I'm happy to bring you the wisdom of Dan Bader, a licensed clinical professional counselor and licensed marriage and family therapist. He has been trained to independently diagnose and treat mental health and substance abuse problems and has 23 years of experience working in community settings. He retired from the Chicago Department of Public Health in 2016. All right, let's move into Dan's presentation. And if there's time at the end, we can open the floor for some questions. So Dan, what topic will you be presenting tonight?
Yes, thank you, Staci, for the introduction. I'm going to talk about treatment of psychotic problems. I'm going to try to interweave into that some of the fundamental problems in our mental health delivery system, if I can get there. But let me start with going over what we're talking about in terms of psychotic problems. So I have a lot of material here, and I did a presentation using this slide deck previously a number of weeks ago, but there was enough that I really never was able to get to, but I'm going to repeat a little bit of what I went over. I want to start by saying, when we're talking psychotic problems, that usually means we're talking about hallucinations, really auditory hallucinations, people hearing voices, and delusions, people having beliefs that are not rooted in consensual reality, and usually have sort of maladaptive consequences. So if we look at hallucinations, hallucinations are not misperceptions or illusions. It's something we perceive in the absence of an external stimulus. So if a person's hearing voices, there isn't a voice coming from the outside into the person's mind brain, but they are hearing it. And it's often, now I would say also that there's other types of hallucinations. Usually if a person has these problems, it pretty much says you've got a neurological problem, something of that nature, whether if it's visual, tactile, olfactory, gustatory, somatics in some cases. But mostly what we're talking about are auditory hallucinations. And one of the problems that people who are psychotic and are hearing voices that they have is called the source monitoring problem. And this is very key. So what the person has difficulty being able to determine is whether something is coming from the outside in or it's being generated within the mind. So like, for example, I can think, we all think silent thoughts all the time. And generally speaking, we know we're generating that. Someone who might be having psychotic problems, their silent thoughts sometimes will appear like they're being inserted. It feel like it's coming from the outside in instead of recognizing it's internally generated. And likewise with the voices. And so we just want to recognize that there is very frequently something of an organic component or vulnerability involved with hallucinations. Now, so auditory hallucinations are experienced according to this data, which again, and this is going back some years, but it's probably still pretty accurate, by 4% of the population. Now, for example, let's say, an interesting case is where, let's say somebody is a medium. They are a medium, they go into an altered state of consciousness, and they are able to, or they present themselves anyway, as being able to hear voices, let's say, of people who have been deceased for a while, or maybe, it's some famous personage, that is somehow, they are now the medium for that communication. And, is that an auditory hallucination or, is it real? Anyway, 4% of the population do experience auditory hallucinations. Half of the people who experience auditory hallucinations adapt to the voices, and this would mean, chronic hallucinations, and ultimately do not find the voices to be unduly distressing or unmanageable. And that's important to know. At least 75% of schizophrenics experience auditory hallucinations. Voices usually emerge after a traumatic experience or a period of chronic emotional dysregulation. Now, those who have been, maybe saw some of my previous presentations know that if you have what I call need deficiencies, need areas, emotional support, community involvement, financial stability, individual development, that's going to give you chronic emotional pain. And this is pointing out, that the voices come after a period of chronic emotional dysregulation or a very traumatic experience. And one thing to note is, if you were really trying to prevent somebody having problems with auditory hallucinations, or the emergence of it, one of the things that you would want to be aware of is that their human needs should be attended to. That could prevent possibly the emergence of psychotic symptomology. Okay. And as I mentioned before, and a lot of people, just don't know this because it's kept repressed for, certain reasons. Auditory hallucinations and silent verbal thoughts constitute a gradient of speech subvocalizations that are measurable with a machine called an electromyograph that records the activation of the muscles involved in speech production. And the onset of auditory hallucinations coincides with this, if you're using a device to measure this, with a significant spike in the activity of speech production musculature and with increased activity in the left temporal lobe, the part of the brain responsible for speech production and perception. So, that's very important to kind of note. Back when I was working, say, and especially in the 1990s, where, they were handing out disability money for people who had psychiatric problems. They also were giving it out at a point for addiction problems. So oftentimes, people would say they were hearing voices because they knew that would guarantee them getting disability. If you had a psychotic disorder, you're hearing voices, they were going to give you disability. And, and then of course, who would know whether they were or not, because they were just saying they were hearing it. Um, and as far as the medication went, they get medication, which was pretty potent, but they didn't necessarily take it. They weren't being monitored, blood work to see if you are actually even using the medication. So after a while, that became kind of tightened up. But clearly, theoretically, you could have measured whether or not the hallucination was, for real or not. And there's just somebody hooked up. Okay, so now this is important to know that voices, the auditory hallucination voices, mirror relationships. So a person's relationship with their voices tend to mirror their relationships with other people. Persecutory voices are usually associated with low social rank. Where are you on the socioeconomic, hierarchy? And an inability to effectively set interpersonal and intrapersonal boundaries. So if people were being treated beyond medication, they would have to learn how to set interpersonal and intrapersonal boundaries, which could be of significant assistance in having them get things under control, even if they could never get rid of the voices completely. And persecutory voices reflect a contemptuous style of rendering judgments. And again, I used to teach them, I would say, look, every time you judge somebody, it's reinforcing. We're hardwired to get a positive reinforcement when we render a judgment, so every time you make a judgment, it feels good when you're the judge. Doesn't feel so good when you're the one being judged. Now, if you have a voice going off in your mind that's always putting you down, telling you how unattractive you are, how unintelligent you are, how disgusting you are, etc., which is common with these auditory hallucinations. It's important for the person to just know this, just to have an insight that every time that happens, it's positively reinforced. It's kind of like when you get angry with yourself, and maybe you refer to yourself as I'm such a loser, I'm such a this or that. When you do that, the part of you that's rendering that judgment feels strong and righteous, and that's reinforcing. But the rest of you, which is victimized by that judgment, doesn't feel so good. And again, it's just important, I believe, for people to have these kinds of insights, because it can be helpful. It's not going to be sufficient to get rid of certain problems, but it's important. Now, yes, Staci.
So what about those voices that people say they want them to kill people?
Well, some people do hear voices that say, go kill somebody, or they may hear a voice that says, go kill yourself, go jump off the bridge or off the building or shoot yourself. Now, again, the voice, those voices, kind of they command hallucinations. They can be dangerous, if a person isn't able to, in a sense, say no. Again, when I talk about boundary setting, and when we're talking either an interpersonal boundary, I say no to you, no, don't say that to me again, or don't treat me that way. It's saying no to somebody else. when I'm being harsh with myself, I need to be able to say no to myself. Stop it, Dan. Put the brakes on. Shut up. I have to be able to do that. Yes, Staci.
So, what kind of a relationship is mirrored when it's like you should kill somebody and not themselves?
Well, I mean, a lot of times, if you think about it, you say, what kind of action is going on there? Go kill somebody. Again, a lot of times that can be, kind of riding on a certain kind of anger, resentment, jealousy, the kinds of things that make us, most people will have homicidal ideation now and then. It comes and it goes quickly, and people don't act on it. But it's important that the person who's experiencing this has some insight, a little bit of psychoeducational insight into what is going on, so that they, and unfortunately, as I'll go into, uh, basically the only real treatment that is offered for hallucinations and delusions, which sometimes are, going together, um, is medication. It's just simply medication in order to shut down the emotional reactivity. So you could hear, I had one client. Uh, she was a very nice woman, but she would have these hallucinate. Well, she would actually have, it would be not usually auditory hallucinations, but she would have these thoughts that would be um, hurt a child, go and hurt a child. And these would be very disturbing to her. But again, the what she had to be able to do would be to simply say no. That's not something, to work that in her mind. But she took medication, and what the medication did for her, and she took a lot of it, was she still heard the voice or the thought, usually again, whether it was just silent thoughts urging her to hurt a child. But when she was very heavily medicated, she would not have any problem controlling herself. In other words, she'd still hear or have the silent thought, but it would not get her emotionally worked up to a place where she might actually do something. And then she probably never would have done anything under any circumstance, but she was given, very heavy medication, and the medication will anesthetize to a certain degree emotional reactivity. And if you don't have that emotional energy, you're not likely to do very much. Okay, so so clients should be taught. Well, first of all, they should be taught that actually we can show you that what it is you're hearing is actually a subvocalization, and we can measure it. That might be useful to know. So it could contribute to a person understanding that it's not the voice of your deceased father telling you to go jump off a bridge. It's not that. We can show you, and the person could still say, well, somehow, my deceased father is controlling, the subvocalization. It can go on and on with rationalizations over what's happening. Clients should be taught that voices can be conceptualized as a slight amplification of silent thoughts, and that's what it is. Clients can be taught that most voices reflect relationship and interpersonal communication problems. Clients can learn via rehearsal and practice to change contemptuous criticisms into respectful criticisms. So I would say, I would have a client, I would say, the voice you hear is extremely disrespectful. And we define what disrespect was, but it's extremely disrespectful to you. And here's what, I would like you to do. I know it's really hard to control the voice itself. It's very dissociated, but what you can do is when you're angry at somebody else, criticize them in a respectful fashion. And when somebody is disrespecting you, try to ask them to express themselves in a respectful fashion. The idea being that can generalize and alter the nature of the voices that are being the auditory hallucinations. And is that something which is necessarily going to work? No, but again, in order for somebody to get a bit of control over what's going on with them, even if they can never get the voice to change from being just totally disrespectful, they understand the dynamic that's really occurring, and to learn not to pay attention to it. I mean, again, when learning to set boundaries, if somebody won't stop being disrespectful, you need to distance yourself from them. You don't want to keep interacting with them if you can get away from them. And people can learn to just sort of disregard the voice. Now, if they get heavily medicated, they will do that. They will disregard the voice. It'll still be there. It doesn't go away usually, rarely. Will it go away, but it doesn't cause the person to act out from what it is they're hearing. So, all right. Okay, so now this, I'm going to quickly go into delusions. And I always, I emphasize beliefs in any kind of mental health material I'm dealing with, because it's really critical. And what I'm going to go into on beliefs and delusions, it's very, what goes on in our world, in our socio-political world that we live in. It's very much a problem in terms of the manipulation of beliefs. The people who are experts at propaganda, they know this inside out. They know how to control what a person believes, and it's something that everybody should, become smart about. So when a decision is made or a belief is formed, consciousness is affected in the following ways. Your consciousness is granted easy access to information that supports the belief. Number two, consciousness is denied easy access to information that contravenes the belief, that goes against your belief. So you've got a whole kind of library in there of information, knowledge that you have, that you've assimilated, and it's there in your memory, but and the thing is, once you form a belief, like let's say Donald Trump is, Adolf Hitler reincarnated or something. He is totally evil. Donald Trump is very bad. Once you have that belief, you're not going to get rid of that very easily. Now, you before you get there, you may have a hypothesis about, let's say, Donald Trump. Oh, Donald Trump, I used to think, how the hell could someone like that be running for president? A reality TV person who was a real estate developer. But you can have hypotheses about Donald Trump, but it's a different when you just have a hypothesis about something and when you cross over into a belief. So once that belief is formed, it's not that easy to ever let it go. And what number 3 says, if information that contravenes, goes against the belief, enters consciousness, it is usually rejected via rationalization or minimization. So uh, the people who control our propaganda through the media mostly quite well, um, they know this. They know that, well, so what do? They have all sorts of clever ways of giving you rationalizations and minimizations concerning information that goes against the belief that you have. Uh, honestly, they know this inside out. And so, for example, uh, if you look at what they do with, the fact checking. So a lot of the fact checking, which has, been introduced and popularized through Facebook and other social media. The idea there is, well, and especially during this whole, fetishization of Donald Trump, it's just amazing what they did with this guy. But anyway, so there would be, you could fact check things, like Donald Trump would always be dishonest, and all sorts of, anybody who was his supporter or anything like that would be dishonest. And we have fact checkers. So, because you really need it when we got a president of the United States who's a compulsive liar. And of course, in reality, Donald Trump was somebody, he was a run of the mill, really kind of sociopathic character, which politics, when you look at politicians, lawyers, corporate people, they're all over the place. He wasn't really unusual in that sense. But yeah, he was somebody who had no problem lying. But fact checking, who's going to check the fact checkers? That what they know that isn't going to go on. You're going to believe, oh, this fact checker, they're reliable. They'll tell me. And so, they could use, and they have used the fact checking to allow you to easily rationalize away something that doesn't fit the current narrative, or to minimize it away. And, it's just, I never dreamed I would see what's happened in the United States, the propaganda that has essentially taken hold. Now, number 4 is beliefs can be imprinted by authority figures or group pressure, slash social influence. So again, fact checkers, authority figures, people on, the news. If you were a fan of CNN or MSNBC during the Trump years, those were authority figures that you were listening to and believing that, yeah, what they're telling you is true. And then if you liked Fox News, you'd get kind of a different narrative. But again, those were all authority figures. And you can't. It would, and the reason that they get away with it so easily is because, again, we come into the world as children who have no experience in the world. We have to rely on the authority figures, parents, other authority figures, to tell us what's good, what's bad, what's real, what's not real, etc. And hopefully most of what they give us when we're young is reliable, that it's actually veridical and to some degree, but that's how we are. And so when we're adults and we don't know something, I don't really know very much about economics or law or this or, whatever, I'm going to be like a child. And if I have somebody who I take as an authority figure, they will imprint me with my beliefs, my attitudes about things. And of course, the people who control the propaganda, mostly these are, they're intelligence community people some in the military, some in the, a lot of them are going to be in academia, but a lot of them will be in the intelligence community. And, they are very, very skilled at managing large groups of people through propaganda. And all countries do it to some degree. Never, though, to the extent that what we're under, in my opinion. So then you go to off of beliefs. You go to delusions. And delusions are false beliefs that are usually idiosyncratic, resistant to counter-argument, and impair functioning according to the expectations of consensual reality. And so, the difference between a belief and a delusion is just that. A delusion is a belief that doesn't fit consensual reality narrative and usually causes a person to get in some kind of trouble. And then I point out, delusional beliefs exist on a continuum with ordinary beliefs. Normal belief crystallization processes support the strength of delusional beliefs. The belief confirmation bias provides easy access to supportive information and filters out counter arguments. That's why in the mental health world, if somebody's delusional, there's nothing we can do about their delusions. We're going to give them the medication so they don't do impulsive kind of destructive things as a result of their delusions. But we really can't get rid of them. So we're going to anesthetize their emotions so that they don't feel compelled to act things out. And again, I point out here that the specific content of delusions will reflect cultural and historical context. However, they almost always reflect a mixture of the themes of predator-prey, social inclusion, exclusion, and dominant submission and or shame, pride. That's pretty much it. And we have to recognize that. When I was presenting last week, I brought up the reality that when we're not focused on some task, like right now, I'm doing a presentation. You guys are paying attention to what it is I'm saying. So you're focused on something external, and I am also. But when we're not focused on some sort of task in the external world, some problem we're trying to solve, what we're going to have go through our mind generally is going to be issues of what are others thinking of me? How do I stack up? Is that person got it in for me? So on. Or what do I need to do to pay that person back? This is where we go to. And again, it's just kind of important to know that, to just be aware of that, because a lot of times what you can teach someone, when there's one strategy for dealing with people who are depressed is called behavioral activation. What that means is you tell the person when they're off in their depressive thoughts and so on, just do something. Go ahead and wash the windows, take the garbage out, go to the store, just do something. And that will take you away from being trapped in these very depressive kinds of thoughts. And you need to learn to do that as a regular practice. Now, many delusions, such as thought withdrawal, thought insertion, and thought broadcasting, are in part created by a person's attempt to explain their hallucinations and source monitoring problems. Again, source monitoring problem is I can't tell necessarily whether something is coming from out to in. It's like you're hearing my voice right now. You know that's my voice. It's not something going off internally in your head. In other words, there's a stimulus to what you end up perceiving in your mind brain. But with a source monitoring problem, people aren't able to do that very easily. And so again, thought withdrawal means a person feels that, their thoughts are being taken away from them or inserted into them. Or people, they're broadcasting their thoughts. And again, these are things which people have to learn to deal with in other situations. So this shame, pride, access delusions, which are really common. So grandiose delusions, where you got all the pride in the world, usually center around themes of great power or strength, special missions, special identities. You're really important, and possession of great wealth. Persecutory delusions usually center around the theme of being victimized or rejected by other individuals or groups. The FBI is after me. Persecutory delusions generate strong anxiety associated with predator-prey and or social exclusion dynamics. And this predator-prey, soon I'll do a presentation on psychopathy. And one of the things is that psychopaths are pretty much into predator-prey motivational it's the way that they operate in the world. So someone like Donald Trump is very much into predator-prey type of motivation. Those who they see themselves, psychopaths see themselves as predators. They want to be the best. They want to be the head predator if they can, but that's how they see themselves. And they see everybody else as being prey. And they have great contempt for when they exploit someone. It's not like when a psychopath exploits someone, it's not like they, oh God, maybe I shouldn't have done that. That wasn't I don't know, I did it. I wish I hadn't. Maybe I can do something to make up for it. No, they don't have that at all. What they go to is, that person was stupid enough to be taken by me, and therefore they deserve it. Nothing but contempt for the victim. Now, we've got a lot of those people operating in a culture like we have, unfortunately, today, because that kind of behavior gets incentivized in many, many ways. Winners, losers, and it's again, you see it, if you see a politician, and you always need to look very carefully at that person, because again, so many of them, even if they're well-intentioned in the beginning, they can start to let the inner psychopath start to come in and take over as they try to go up in the ranks. Okay. Now here, I'm not going to go over this here today, but I put in here again, because it's important in terms of treatment for anybody who's suffering from these kinds of delusions or auditory hallucinations, to understand fully how you manage shame. Very, very important. Now, again, just because of the time, I'm not going to go over that today. And so I want to, and I'm not going to, let me move to, okay, let me move down here to, see. Okay. These are theories of schizophrenia. These are very common ones. I'm going to go over these. And as I go over it, think in terms of what kind of treatment the theory that you have of schizophrenia, what kind of treatment does that imply? And I'll try to point some of this out. So the most common one is the dopamine hypothesis. Last week, I was talking about, one of the theories of depression has to do with the neurotransmitter serotonin. If you don't have enough serotonin, you're going to be depressed. We'll give you medication to amp up your serotonin transmission. End of the problem. It's absurd. It's just ridiculous to think that that is going to take care in terms of any sort of duration, a person's vulnerability to depression, that alone. But anyway, so the dopamine hypothesis for psychotic symptoms, the dopamine hypothesis asserts that the delusions and hallucinations that characterize schizophrenia result from an excess of dopamine in the brain. Deficiency in serotonin, depression. Excess of dopamine, the amount or maybe the speed of transmission, that gives you psychotic symptoms. So researchers noted that antipsychotic drugs blockade dopamine receptors and reduce the strength of psychotic symptoms and the associated emotional reactivity. It's that emotional reactivity which really gives person problems and others. So an antipsychotic medication can reduce the flow or the amount of dopamine that's, the brain, the cells in the brain are called, there's two kinds. There's neurons and what they call glial cells, but it's the neurons which are really important. And they sort of operate by transmitting electrochemical impulses between from one neuron to another neuron. So here's the diagram. You can see this at the top there, that is one neuron. There's a little space there they call a synapse. And so it puts out dopamine, and then there are receptors in this little simple model on the next neuron, which takes in the dopamine, and it goes on. So the dopamine hypothesis is just simply, you've got a problem with too much dopamine. And it was noted that certain medications such as amphetamines and L-Dopa, for Parkinson's, that increase dopamine levels in the brain sometimes cause people to experience psychotic symptoms. Just like if you're sleep deprived enough, you may get psychotic symptoms. So to them, it was like, well, so if you take a lot of amphetamines, and of course, they weren't necessarily factoring out the fact that if you keep taking amphetamines or cocaine, you might not sleep for a long time. And that in and of itself can cause the psychotic symptomology. When schizophrenics ingest amphetamines, methylphenidates like Ritalin or cocaine, their psychotic symptoms increase. So there you go. The dopamine hypothesis of schizophrenia. You just have a problem with too much dopamine going through your brain. Now, it was then also noted that schizophrenics had a significantly higher number of dopamine receptors. If they did, after the person died, they could sometimes, look and actually see what was going on in the brain. So again, antipsychotic medications, pretty much will blunt out emotional reactivity. Chemically induced dopamine depletion leads to blunted emotional responsivity, clouded thinking, loss of motivation, and lowered vigilance. So let's put a stop to the dopamine, and then you might not have the psychotic symptoms, but you're going to have, or at least they're not going to motivate you to do something foolish, but you're going to have blunted emotional responsivity, clouded thinking, loss of motivation, lowered vigilance. Is that a worthwhile trade-off? If there's nothing else that a person believes could be done, maybe, but it's quite a cost you have to pay. But here, it was eventually discovered that antipsychotic medications were mainly responsible for the increased density of dopamine receptors in the brains of schizophrenics. So it was actually the antipsychotic medication that was increasing the number of dopamine receptors. The increase in dopamine receptors was the brain's way of compensating for the dopamine blockade induced by antipsychotic medications. So, in essence, the brain would say, you know, we need to grow, essentially sprout new dopamine receptors because we're not getting enough dopamine. And so what happens is, it should be noted that this medication-induced increase in dopamine receptors increases the probability of a strong upsurge of psychotic symptoms when an antipsychotic medication is abruptly discontinued. Because now you've got many, many more receptors than you ever had in the first place. So again, antipsychotic medications in some situations may be the best way to go, but very few, really very few in terms of the overall population where you could argue that. And you need it, and you would need to try other things. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this one because, again, there's time here, considerations. But one, the cat parasite hypothesis is out there, where it's believed that it's triggered by a parasite. I don't, it's not a major theory that people rely on, but it's there. But let's look at this one, the brain structure abnormality hypothesis. This invalidated hypothesis, it's not considered valid, but it was popular, asserted that a brain structure abnormality caused by a genetic predisposition and stress is the cause of schizophrenia. MRI and CT scans showed enlarged lateral ventricles in the brains of schizophrenic patients. Researchers believed they had concrete evidence of a brain disease. They loved it. However, they failed to realize that many other variables were highly correlated with enlarged lateral ventricles, such as alcoholism, depression, early childhood trauma, lower social class, old age, pregnancy, and head size. A lot of variables to deal with there. And the most reliable predictor of increased ventricular size is the usage of antipsychotic medication. So a lot of people were disappointed when the brain structure abnormality hypothesis failed. Now, this one is, again, the hypermentalism hypothesis is, I'll just briefly go a little bit into that. This hypothesis asserts that schizophrenic symptoms result from a genetically driven oversensitivity to one's own emotional signals and the emotional signals of others when under sufficient stress. This is a manifestation of the stimulus gating problem that many, many schizophrenics have. In other words, they have a problem gating out stimuli. So noises will disturb them much more than, let's say, people who do not have a stimulus gating problem. And so this is in mentalizing, hypermentalism hypothesis. Mentalizing is the term that describes our attempt to figure out the beliefs, attitudes, motives, and intentions of another person. So the idea here is that these people who are schizophrenic essentially have a problem where they're hyper mentalizing. And then it was noted that people who suffer from autism, they would say they have a hypomentalism problem. In other words, they actually have problems really perceiving the emotions and what's going on with other people. And so again, it's an interesting hypothesis, and it's still around. Now, this is one which is probably not a bad one. This is the diathesis stress hypothesis. So a diathesis is a vulnerability or predisposition to experience a disorder or disease. So you're somebody who genetically, by heredity and some experiences in your early life, you are now vulnerable to having something happen. And the diathesis for schizophrenia is thought to be a genetic predisposition, usually accompanied by severe environmental stressors. Researchers have argued that there probably is a specific gene that is necessary for schizophrenia to occur. However, it has to be combined with other genes associated with traits such as social introversion. And you can take that for what it's worth, might not be worth very much, but there is definitely a genetic vulnerability that can be there. Once the schizophrenic condition has emerged, the frequency and intensity of symptoms will be a function of the stressors the individual is exposed to and their capacity to cope with the stress. The environmental triggers and/or maintenance factors. So the environmental triggers that set off the psychotic episode, or the environmental things that are just chronic, the maintenance factors, include pregnancy and obstetric complications, drug abuse, poverty, neglect, isolation, loneliness, chronic physical, emotional, or sexual abuse. Exposure to high levels of expressed negative emotion and a contemptuous style of self-evaluation are key symptom maintenance factors. So again, people need to learn how to set interpersonal and intrapersonal boundaries. And just because you're suffering from psychotic symptomology, you need to learn this just like anybody else who maybe has got a depressive disorder or an anxiety disorder kind of thing. Exposure to high levels, again, of expressed negative emotion and a contemptuous style of self-evaluation are key symptom maintenance factors. When people would come out of the hospital after a psychotic episode, there would be, they talk with the family, if the person lived with their family, and they would say, please don't attack, don't be verbally abusive to this person. Please don't do that, because this will set off an episode. Again, normally, the only, the key, again, somebody goes in the hospital, they get heavily medicated, and then they eventually are released. Okay. Treatment strategies. So there's a number of treatment strategies that I list here. And again, just in basically, some of them are, you can have psychotherapies which emphasize cognitive behavioral and emotion management strategies. Okay, that's important. Participation in recovery-oriented groups help prevent relapse. If you're part of a group, you got a community involvement, and it's probably helping you with emotional support and also helping you grow as a person, the things you learn. If you don't have that, you're going to be vulnerable to relapse. Medication is usually necessary to halt a severe breakdown and help achieve a stabilized state. Okay. And as I would, always say to a client, I'd say, look, if I'm awake for 48 hours, I'm calling up my doctor and asking them to give me a sleeping pill to knock me out, because I don't want to go psychotic. It could happen. The average person is vulnerable to that if it goes on. There are some people who can go long stretch without that happening, but they're few and far between. And then you have to look at, the long-term problems with medication. You have to make sure people get informed consent. They know what, the options are and so on. But let me, again, because there's just such limited time, I've gone to, I do want to just, again, go over this one thing, and then, which I did the last time I went into this particular slide deck. So this is about the overdiagnosis of psychotic problems. Psychotic symptoms, this sluggishly progressive schizophrenia, that's from Russian, was a diagnosis, a psychiatric diagnosis in the Soviet Union. Psychotic symptoms, in other words, hallucinations, auditory hallucinations, were not necessary to diagnose the disorder. But delusions would be there. So individuals who suffered from this condition could frequently pass as normal. Reform delusions, religious beliefs, pessimism, perseverance problems with authority, and struggle for the truth were common symptoms of the disorder. Many well-known Soviet dissidents were diagnosed with this disorder. During the 1980s, Russia/Soviet Union had 3 times as many schizophrenics per capita as the United States. Hospitalization, incarceration, and treatment with antipsychotic medications, all of which induce indifference and apathy, were used to treat this disorder. Now, what we have going on in the United States today, it's really dangerous. And most people, aren't aware of it, or even if it's pointed out, it's hard to assimilate. But we have going on right now, we have a bitterly divided country. This is a serious political, socio-political divide that is operating today. And it's centering around right now, as we're talking today, over 2 things: the COVID-19 bioweapon vaccination set of problems and issues. And the second one is the presidential election, where, let's say, half the people feel there's a good probability the thing was fraudulent. The other half calls that the big lie. No, couldn't possibly be fraudulent, had to be legitimate. Now, these are the 2 big issues that are very, very dangerous right now, because what you have is, it's out there in the environment, the idea that we have to round people up. Let's say, right now you have the Democratic Party, the Biden administration, and the Democratic Party-oriented intelligence community people basically pushing out there, kind of trial ballooning it quite a bit, that we need to have re-education camps for Trump supporters. They just need, they're kind of delusional. They actually believe that the election was fraudulent. We can't have that. That makes them potentially dangerous. Look what happened on January 6th, the insurrection. Um, and we need to get these people, we hate to go this way, but maybe we need to round them up and get them re-educated, kind of like what they do in China right now with the Uyghurs. And what they did, and obviously in the Soviet Union, you could be in a mental hospital and then you could be out in the gulag in somewhere in Siberia. So this is very, very kind of a dangerous thing. And you notice again, the difference between, and look, it could go the other way. Again, a lot of people, you have to realize that, and with the vaccination, for example, people like myself believe that vaccinations have never been necessary to deal with COVID. But on the other hand, that's a big heresy from the point of view of the government narrative and the public health narrative. They don't want to hear, until recently, they didn't even want to hear about a bioweapon hypothesis as to what this was in the first place. They basically discredited ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine, medications that were very effective and are effective against COVID-19. And they did it primarily, I think, in order to get the emergency use authorization for these vaccinations. And now you're having, these vaccinations are causing apparently significant damages to many people. And you don't even have an idea of what it's going to mean down the road. This is very sophisticated kind of development of bioweapon. But we even had this doctor, I think his name is Peter McCullough, who is a very, very conservative, very highly respected doctor from, I'm not sure whether it's Baylor or one of the large medical centers in Texas University, who actually came out the other day and said the vaccines themselves are bioweapons. In other words, it's a two-stage kind of a deal. You get the COVID-19 circulating, and then we introduce the vaccines. Now, this is something in a sane society would be debated and discussed, and people would have the opportunity for informed consent. But again, there's a big danger here because of all the implications. Now, this could go the other way. You could have somehow we'll say the Trump side. And an interesting thing is the Trump half of the country, and I'm speaking in the most general way, they tune in to alternative media to get their information, where the Democratic Party side of the country looks at the corporate media, usually excluding Fox. Now, so we have two different inputs going on with our population. If you go to the alternative media, you see plenty of doctors and public health people and lawyers talking about the dangers of the vaccinations, et cetera. If you go to the corporate media, you just see them, they say, well, what are we going to do to get people vaccinated? These unvaccinated people, they're going to endanger themselves and others, and we got to do something about it. This is a unbelievably dangerous kind of situation we have in the country. And this particular sluggishly progressive schizophrenia is, it's exactly what can easily happen here. And it could go both ways. You could go, right now, it's the Democratic Party, the intelligence community, et cetera, those kind of individuals talking about re-education camps for the dangerous insurrectionists who supported Trump. But you can go the other way too. Those individuals could obtain power and they could go the other way with the other side. This is something which shouldn't be allowed to really be kind of brewing, in the background. One final thing, and then I'm done, is, and unfortunately, but I did want to see. Okay, just two things real quickly. I know I've only have a few minutes, but I wanted to bring up this stagnant caseload problem. This is important for the mental health system. A stagnant caseload is when people, therapists, for example, or social workers, therapists of all kinds, they have a caseload. And usually the average person who's being treated for a mental health problem is getting therapy and/or case management plus medication. Now, what happens is if you're taking medication because of the economic incentives by the pharmaceutical corporations and the psychiatrists, you're going to take that medication for as long as they can keep you on it. But what this does is it absorbs slots in the mental health system. So people who really could use therapy and case management, they can't get in. They get put on these waiting lists because you've got all these people who are taking medication long-term. They have to be monitored. The psychiatrists themselves usually aren't going to do that. They'll see you for 20 minutes, give you your prescription once you've been diagnosed. So what that does is there's an inability to provide much needed services to the communities in an efficient and timely fashion. And it's an over provision of therapy and case management services to some consumers. Because if you're a therapist working, they use a business model. They've been using business models since maybe 2005, somewhere around there. So you have to be productive. You need to rack up the therapy or the case management hours. Well, what are you going to do if you can't get new people in? A new person coming in for therapy or case management help is, they're going to need some intensive care. You're going to really have to work with them. But the people they've been there for 2 years, they're still taking medication. They clog up the system because there is a limit. And so what people end up doing is they just keep giving therapy, which isn't really necessary in a lot of cases, to rack up the productivity, the hours that they need to keep their jobs. And it also creates, I don't have time to go into it, but, record keeping and audit problem. It's just, and again, it's just another example. The mental health system is totally driven by the pharmaceutical corporations and the psychiatrists who forever have not really provided talk therapy. Few do, but almost hardly any of them. And they make their money through the medication. And it prevents people from getting the kind of care they really deserve and could really be helpful. And then you see people, this constant, you can imagine, the mental health parity, the insurance situation where it would be like, we need to give mental health problems coverage in insurance the same way we do other kind of medical problems. But the cost of that, given the way the system is absurd. And at the end of the day, the average person is going to pay for it in terms of what the insurance company charges them. And so these are things, again, which are there. So I know I have to stop. Again, thank you, Staci, for, the opportunity to voice this and get it out there. And I will keep trying to go over some of these things and sort of draw attention as much as possible to how some of these things, concepts, which are very applicable to mental health, it's also applicable to a lot of other things that go on in our society. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dan. I know we kind of go around and cover these topics from different angles, and it's always productive for me. I think, yeah, we might have covered this before, but so much new stuff comes up. There are so many details to cover. I really appreciate and I learn every time. So thank you again, Dan. And to our audience, please come back every week to learn how to connect more of the dots in this vicious cycle of corruption and how it relates to your mental health and quality of life.